October 1944. General George S. Patton stood in a cramped farmhouse in France, staring at a map that screamed defeat. His Third Army was bleeding out faster than replacements could arrive. Tank crews were being vaporized by German 88mm guns. Entire divisions were ground to dust by the Wehrmacht's winter defense. He had 3 weeks, maybe less, before his advance collapsed completely. Then his quartermaster mentioned the reserve. A fully trained tank battalion sat waiting in England, their crews drilled to perfection on M4 Shermans. Combat ready, eager, waiting for the call. But there was one difference that made Washington go silent on every telephone call. One difference that terrified the politicians and unsettled the generals. These men were black. The United States Army in 1944 operated on a lie that had become military doctrine. That black men lacked the intelligence for mechanized warfare, the courage for sustained combat, and the discipline for armored tactics. But they could dig latrines, drive supply trucks, and bury the dead. But to command a 30-ton war machine? Impossible. Patton looked at his depleted forces, then at the fresh battalion of black soldiers sitting idle. He knew the risk wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the newspapers back home. But the Germans weren't waiting for American politics to fix itself. The enemy was digging in, winter was coming, and Patton needed killers. So he made the call. This is the story of the 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers. The men America was afraid to send to war became the soldiers the Wehrmacht learned to fear. But before the Germans knew that name, these men had to survive something far more brutal than combat. They had to survive America itself. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button because your engagement helps us share these untold stories of heroes the history books forgot. These men deserved parades. The least we can do is make sure their story reaches every corner of the world. Now, let's go back to where it all began. To understand the ruthless efficiency the Black Panthers would show in Europe, you have to go back to where they were forged. You have to go to Camp Hood, Texas, where for 2 long years, the men of the 761st trained for a war they weren't sure they would ever be allowed to fight. March 1942. The 761st Tank Battalion arrived at Camp Hood under the scorching Texas sun. The heat was so intense it could crack the paint on a tank hull. The drill instructors were harsher than any they had faced before. While white tank units were rushed through basic training and shipped out in 6 months, the Black Panthers were held back. They ran the same drills over and over and over again until they could operate their Shermans in complete darkness, until they could strip and reassemble a transmission with their eyes closed, until they didn't just drive tanks but made them dance. But the real battle wasn't against the heat or the training schedule. It was against the daily humiliation that reminded them exactly what America thought of them. In the towns surrounding Camp Hood, German prisoners of war, men who had sworn allegiance to Adolf Hitler himself, could walk into a diner and sit down for a hot meal. But the black American soldiers guarding those same prisoners had to eat from the back door. The men of the 761st watched this every single day. They swallowed the insults. They held their rage. They channeled every ounce of frustration into their machines. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was a quiet farmer from Oklahoma who rarely raised his voice. One afternoon, he stood in an alley behind a diner in Killeen, waiting for his food while watching through the window as a German POW sipped coffee at the counter. The German wore the same uniform he had been captured in. Rivers wore the uniform of the United States Army. The German got a seat. Rivers got the back door. He didn't complain. He didn't write home about it. He collected his food, walked back to base, and ran tank drills until midnight. That became his answer to everything. Perfection as armor. Excellence as revenge. The battalion commanders knew the scrutiny they were under. If a white soldier made a mistake during training, it was just a mistake. But if a black soldier made a mistake, it would be used as proof that his entire race was unfit for duty. So they drove the men harder than any other unit in the entire army. The 761st didn't just meet standards. They shattered them. By the time October 1944 rolled around, The men weren't just soldiers anymore. They were a coiled spring, wound tight by years of waiting and humiliation and perfect execution. They had mastered evasive maneuvers that white units never learned because those units were rushed to the front. They knew maintenance tricks that kept Shermans running when others broke down. They had 2 years to perfect what others learned in 6 months. And then the call finally came. General Patton needed them. The waiting was over. The spring was about to uncoil, and God help anyone standing in the way. October 1944. The order came down like lightning through Camp Hood. 48 hours. The 761st Tank Battalion was shipping out to England, then straight to France. After 2 years of waiting, they had 2 days to prepare for war. The men moved with controlled urgency, packing gear, running final maintenance checks on their Shermans, writing letters home that carefully avoided mentioning where they were going or when they might return. The excitement was electric, but it was tempered by the knowledge that they were about to face the deadliest army in history while carrying the weight of an entire race on their shoulders. The crossing to England was rough. The embarkation to France was immediate. No rest, no adjustment period. By late October, they were standing in a muddy staging area near the front lines, and that's when General George S. Patton arrived. He climbed onto a half-track, his pearl-handled revolvers gleaming even in the grey autumn light. He looked out over the sea of black faces, men who had been called every name in the book back home, and his high-pitched voice cut through the cold air like a blade. Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are as long as you go up there and kill those sons of bitches. Everyone has their eyes on you. Show them what you're made of. It wasn't poetry, and it wasn't progressive, but it was the first time a high-ranking white officer spoke to them as warriors instead of servants. Patton offered them no promises of civil rights, no guarantees of dignity back home. He offered them permission to kill, and for men who had spent 2 years being told they weren't capable, that was enough. Later that night, as Patton stood in his command tent reviewing maps, his aide noticed something in the general's expression. The aide asked if he had concerns about the 761 SD's readiness. Patton was quiet for a long moment, then said something he would never repeat publicly. That battalion might be the most disciplined unit I have. That's what worries me. If they perform the way I think they will, how do we justify what we've done to them? The aide had no answer. Neither did Patton. Meanwhile, in the tank park, Private First Class Jimmy Pritchard sat on the tread of his Sherman, writing a letter by flashlight. The words poured out onto the page, all the doubt and anger he had carried for years. He questioned whether dying for a country that hated him made him a fool or a patriot. He questioned whether his sacrifice would mean anything at all. When he finished writing, he read it once, then held the corner of the paper to his cigarette. The letter caught fire, curling into ash. He watched it burn completely, then stood up and checked his ammunition belts 3 times. The doubt was gone. The work would speak for itself. The next morning, the 761st rolled toward the town of Morville-Lesvic. The smell of diesel mixed with the stench of death. Burnt-out tanks littered the roadside like steel tombstones. The white infantry units watched them pass with expressions ranging from silent skepticism to open hostility. The Black Panthers didn't respond. They just kept their eyes forward, hands steady on the controls, waiting for the moment when words would become meaningless and only results would matter. November 7th, 1944. The Lorraine region of France looked like God had given up on it. The ground wasn't solid anymore. It was a freezing soup of mud that sucked boots off feet and dragged 30-ton tanks down to their treads. They called it General Mud, and it killed almost as efficiently as the Germans. The 761st Tank Battalion approached the fortified town of Morville-Lesvic through a grey fog that hid everything beyond 50 yards. The training manuals had told them what to expect in combat, but the manuals never described the sound of a German 88mm shell tearing through the air. It sounded like the sky itself was being ripped apart, followed by an explosion that rattled teeth and turned steel into shrapnel. The first contact came without warning. A flash from the tree line. Then the lead Sherman exploded in a ball of orange flame. The crew never had time to scream. One moment they were advancing, the next they were burning. The smell hit the other crews immediately through their hatches, the nauseating stench of diesel fuel, burning rubber, and cooking flesh. Sergeant Johnny Stevens was in the third tank in the column. He watched the lead Sherman burn and knew exactly what he had to do. The 761st had drilled for this moment 1,000 times. While other units might have frozen or retreated, the Black Panthers executed their training with machine precision. They fanned out into hull-down positions, using the terrain to expose only their turrets while their hulls remained protected behind rises in the ground. It was a tactic they had perfected during those 2 years at Camp Hood, a maneuver that rushed white units never fully mastered because they hadn't been given the time. The Germans were firing at shadows while the 761st was landing kill shots. Stevens maneuvered his Sherman to flank the German position when he saw movement near the burning lead tank. Someone had survived. He pulled his tank to a halt and jumped out, running through machine gun fire to reach the wreckage. The tank commander had been thrown clear, but the fire had caught him. Stevens dragged him away from the flames, but one look told him everything. The medic arrived seconds later, took one glance, and shook his head. "Nothing we can do, Sergeant. Just close his eyes." Stevens did. His hands were shaking, not from fear but from rage. He had trained beside this man for 2 years. They had endured Camp Hood together, shared the same humiliations, the same dreams of proving everyone wrong. Now he was gone in the first hour of combat. Stevens stood up, climbed into another Sherman whose commander had been wounded, and took control. His voice came over the radio, steady and cold. "All units, advance on my position. We're taking that town." The 761st pushed forward with coordinated fire and maneuver tactics that confused the German defenders. One tank would advance while 2 others provided covering fire, then they would leapfrog positions. The white infantry units watching from the flanks didn't understand the technical brilliance of what they were seeing. They just saw results. They saw German positions going silent one by one. By the time the smoke cleared over Morville-Lesvik, the town was secured. The cost was brutal. 3 tanks destroyed, 12 men dead, dozens more wounded. But the mission was complete. The white infantry units who had watched the Black Panthers arrive with skepticism were now requesting their support for the next assault. The 761st had proven they could fight. Now they had to prove they could survive what was coming next. November 10, 1944. Near the town of Vic-sur-Seille, Sergeant Warren G. H. Creasy was leading his Sherman through a narrow approach when the world exploded. A German Panzerfaust rocket screamed out of a hedgerow and slammed into the side of his tank. The impact was deafening, the heat immediate and suffocating. Creasy kicked open the hatch and threw himself out as flames engulfed the interior. He hit the ground hard, his uniform smoking, his ears ringing so loud he couldn't hear the German machine guns opening up around him. Most men surviving a hit like that would crawl into a ditch and thank God for their lives. Most men would retreat to friendly lines and call it a miracle. Warren Creasy wasn't most men. He looked up and saw German infantry advancing, confident they had stopped the American push. He saw the gun emplacements that were pinning down the rest of his battalion. For 3 seconds, maybe less, he made a calculation. He could run back to safety, or he could finish what he started. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Creasy spotted a half-track nearby, an open-topped vehicle with a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the back. He sprinted toward it through a hail of bullets, climbed into the exposed gunner's position, and grabbed the weapon. What happened next would become legend in the 761st. He drove that half-track directly at the German positions. Completely exposed to enemy fire, with bullets kicking up dirt around his tires and pinging off the metal frame, Creasy unleashed a torrent of precision fire. He wasn't spraying wildly. He was hunting. Each burst was calculated, methodical, devastating. He mowed down the German infantry that had been advancing on his disabled tank. He swung the gun toward the machine gun nests that were suppressing his battalion and silenced them one by one. He spotted artillery observers hiding in a farmhouse and turned the building into rubble. For hours, he fought like a man possessed, destroying 6 German emplacements and killing dozens of enemy soldiers. The white infantry units watching from nearby positions couldn't believe what they were seeing. Some of these men had been told their entire lives that black soldiers were timid, that they lacked courage under fire. Now they were watching one man with a machine gun do the work of an entire platoon. Back at Camp Hood, some officers had written in Creasy's file that he was quiet, perhaps too reserved for combat leadership. They had mistaken his calm demeanor for weakness, his thoughtful nature for hesitation. They were wrong. Quiet competence isn't weakness. It's discipline waiting for the moment to strike. By the time the barrel of his gun was smoking and the German counterattack was broken, the rest of the battalion had regrouped and advanced. When Creasy finally climbed down from the half-track, his commanding officer asked him why he didn't withdraw to safety after his tank was destroyed. Creasy looked at him with those same calm eyes and said simply, "There was work to finish, sir." The men started calling him the baddest man in the 761st. But the deeper truth was more painful. How many other Warren Cresses had America lost because the army refused to give them tanks? How many men with that same quiet fire had been relegated to driving trucks or digging latrines, their potential wasted because of the color of their skin? The 761st was proving that excellence had been there all along. America had just not been looking. On November 15th of 1944, near the town of Gebling, France, Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was doing what he always did, leading from the front. His Sherman was the first in the column, the most exposed position, the most dangerous. He wouldn't have it any other way. The mine detonated without warning. The explosion ripped through the bottom of the tank hull, throwing Rivers violently against the steel interior. When he looked down, his leg was destroyed. The blast had torn through flesh and muscle, exposing bone in a way that made even hardened tankers turn away. The pain was blinding, the kind that should make a man pass out immediately. The medics rushed to the scene. They took one look at the sergeant's mangled leg and began prepping him for evacuation. His commanding officer, Captain David Williams, arrived and gave him a direct order. "Reuben, you've done enough. You're going back. That's not a request, that's an order." Rivers looked at his captain with eyes that were already starting to glaze from shock and blood loss. Then he looked past him toward the German lines where the fighting was fiercest. He pushed the morphine syringe away. "I see them, Captain. We'll get them." He refused the stretcher. He refused the order. With a leg that was barely attached, Reuben Rivers climbed into another tank and took command. For 3 more days, he led his platoon through some of the most brutal fighting the Lorraine campaign had seen. The infection was spreading through his blood. The fever was cooking him from the inside. But his voice on the radio remained steady, directing fire, positioning his tanks, keeping his men alive through sheer force of will. By November 18th, Rivers was fading. His face had turned gray, his eyes were sunken, and every movement sent waves of agony through his body. That night, as the battalion prepared for the next day's assault, Rivers called his loader, Private James Murphy, closer. "Murphy, I need you to promise me something. If I don't make it, you tell them we didn't quit. Tell them we never quit." Murphy was crying. Rivers wasn't. His eyes were clear, his voice steady. He had made peace with what was coming. The morning of November 19th arrived cold and gray. The Germans were counterattacking with heavy armor. Rivers was still on the radio, still positioning his tanks where they could do the most damage. Captain Williams pleaded with him one last time over the radio to pull back. Rivers' voice came through the static, calm as always. "I'm almost there, Captain. Just a little further." Those were the last words anyone heard from him. A German 88mm shell located his Sherman with surgical precision. The explosion was direct and catastrophic. The radio went silent. The heart of the 761st stopped beating. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers died at his post, his hand still on the radio transmitter, still trying to guide his men home. Rivers wasn't just a sergeant. He was the living embodiment of everything the 761st stood for: perfection as armor, excellence as defiance, duty above self. His death created a crack in the battalion's emotional armor, and what poured through that crack wasn't grief alone. It was something far more dangerous. It was fury with a target. The 761st was about to show the Wehrmacht what happens when disciplined soldiers stop fighting for approval and start fighting for blood. November 19, 1944. The radio crackled with static. Then Captain Williams' voice came through, tight and controlled. All units, be advised. Staff Sergeant Rivers is KIA. Confirm receipt. One by one, the tank commanders acknowledged. 2nd Platoon confirms. 3rd Platoon confirms. 4th Platoon confirms. Then silence. A full minute of it, stretching across the battalion net like a held breath. No one spoke. No one moved. Then, without a single order being given, every tank in the 761st Tank Battalion loaded armor-piercing rounds. The metallic clank of shells being chambered echoed through the French countryside. Engines roared to life. Treads began grinding forward. No speeches. No tears. Just the cold machinery of war resuming with a new purpose. Something had changed in the 761st, and the Germans were about to feel it. From November 20th through the end of the month, the Black Panthers became something else entirely. The radio chatter that had once been professional and measured turned clipped, efficient, surgical. Where before they fought with discipline to prove their worth, now they fought with precision fury that had nothing to do with approval. This wasn't about showing white officers they were capable anymore. This was about Rivers. This was about every man who had died while America debated whether they deserved to be here at all. The battalion's kill ratio spiked dramatically. They stopped taking defensive positions and started hunting. When German units dug in, the 761st didn't wait for artillery support or infantry backup. They just attacked, coordinating their fire with a cold efficiency that left burning German steel in their wake. German communications officers began intercepting reports from Wehrmacht units in the Lorraine sector. The reports mentioned Schwarzteufel, which is translated to Black Devils. The reports came with a tone that wasn't mockery. It was fear. Units were requesting reinforcement specifically because they were facing the 761st. Some German soldiers started surrendering rather than fight them. The white officers in 12 Corps noticed the change. In staff meetings, they discussed the 761SD's performance with a mixture of admiration and discomfort. The battalion had always been disciplined, but now there was something else in their actions, something that made even veteran commanders uneasy. Grief, when channeled through military precision, becomes a devastating weapon. One 12 Corps colonel remarked to his aide that the 761st fought like men who had stopped caring about survival and started caring only about the mission. The aide asked if that was a problem. The colonel was quiet for a moment, then said, "It's effective. That's what matters. But I wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of it." The transformation was complete. The 761st had entered the war as soldiers trying to prove they belonged. After Rivers' death, they became something more terrifying, an avenging force that combined professional excellence with personal fury. They weren't fighting for medals or recognition anymore. They were fighting because a good man had died leading them, and the only way to honor that sacrifice was to finish what he started. The Wehrmacht had faced the Russian winter and the Allied bombing campaigns, but they had never faced grief weaponized through discipline. The Black Panthers were teaching them that lesson town by town, tank by tank, shell by shell. And they were just getting started. It was December 1944. Adolf Hitler gambled everything on one last massive offensive through the Ardennes forest. He masked his remaining panzer divisions in secret, then launched a surprise attack designed to split the Allied armies in two. The American lines buckled. Chaos spread. Thousands of soldiers were surrounded in the Belgian town of Bastogne, including the entire 101st Airborne Division. General Patton received an impossible order. Turn the entire Third Army 90 degrees north, march through the worst blizzard Europe had seen in decades, and smash into the German flank to relieve Bastogne. It was a logistical nightmare that required speed, precision, and units willing to drive straight into hell without hesitation. Patton called for the Black Panthers. By December 22nd, the 761st peeled off from their positions and drove north into a white apocalypse. The temperature dropped below zero. The roads became sheets of black ice. The steel of the tanks turned so cold that bare skin would stick to it and peel off. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. The world became a wall of white static. Other armored units said it was impossible to maintain formation in conditions like this. The 761st navigated by compass and dead reckoning, using techniques they had overtrained on during those 2 years at Camp Hood. They communicated through radio when they could, and by instinct when they couldn't. They drove day and night, engine straining, tracks slipping on ice, fighting the elements before they even reached the enemy. Christmas Day 1944. The 761st was pinned down in a frozen forest by German artillery. Shells screamed overhead, detonating in the treetops and sending shrapnel and splinters raining down on the tanks. Private Ernest Jenkins sat inside his Sherman with his loader, both of them shivering despite their layered uniforms. Jenkins reached into his pocket and pulled out his last chocolate bar, a gift from the Red Cross he had been saving. He broke it in half and handed a piece to his loader. They didn't talk about Christmas. They didn't talk about home or family or what they were missing. They just shared the chocolate in silence and waited for the shelling to stop so they could advance again. That was Christmas for the Black Panthers. Half a chocolate bar and the promise of more killing when the barrage lifted. On December 26th, the 761st broke through the German encirclement near the town of Tillet. They smashed into the German 5th Parachute Division with such ferocity that the enemy lines collapsed. When the link-up with Bastogne was finally made, the screaming eagles of the 101st Airborne emerged from their defensive positions, exhausted and half-frozen. They saw black tankers climbing out of Shermans, and some of them cried. These were white soldiers, some from the deep south, men who might have refused to share a meal with these tankers a year ago. But relief has no color when death surrounds you. Brotherhood has no barriers when you're saved by men willing to drive through a blizzard to pull you out of hell. The 761st had done the impossible. Now they turned their eyes east, toward Germany itself. In March 1945, the 761st Tank Battalion stood before the Siegfried line, Hitler's final defensive wall on the German border. It was a nightmare of engineering, miles of concrete dragon's teeth tank traps, bunkers with walls 6 feet thick, and artillery pre-sighted on every approach. It was designed to be impenetrable, the last fortress of the 1,000-year Reich. The Germans hadn't planned for the Black Panthers. The 761st didn't approach with caution. They approached with speed and fury. They blasted gaps in the concrete barriers with concentrated fire. They poured shells into the pillboxes until the guns went silent. They moved so fast they often outran their own supply lines, navigating with captured German maps when their own intelligence couldn't keep up. Within days, they punched through the Siegfried line and crossed onto German soil. The symbolic weight was staggering. The Nazi ideology was built on the lie of Aryan supremacy, the belief that the white race was superior to all others, especially black people. Yet here were the descendants of slaves driving American steel into the heart of the fatherland, shattering the Wehrmacht's defenses with a precision that made mockery of every racist theory the Third Reich had ever published. German soldiers began surrendering in massive numbers. But something strange started happening. Some units specifically requested to surrender to the 761st rather than fight them. The reputation had spread. The Black Devils were unstoppable, and resistance was suicide. One afternoon near a captured town, a German officer approached Sergeant Warren Creasy with his entire company trailing behind him. The officer was aristocratic, stiff-backed, every inch the Prussian ideal. He held out his sidearm with a trembling hand, expecting to be executed on the spot. That's what Nazi propaganda had told him would happen if he surrendered to black American soldiers. Creasy took the officer's weapon, checked it professionally, and handed him a POW processing form. No speech. No lecture. No revenge. He processed the surrender by the book, then moved on to the next objective. The German officer stood there, confusion spreading across his face as these supposedly inferior soldiers demonstrated more discipline and professionalism than he had been trained to expect. The cruelty wasn't in revenge. The cruelty was in excellence. The 761st maintained an intentional silence during German surrenders. They didn't gloat about the irony. They didn't remind the Germans of what their propaganda had claimed. They simply accepted surrender with cold efficiency, letting the enemy soldiers sit with the cognitive dissonance of everything they had been told being revealed as a lie. The humiliation was in the perfection. In watching men they were taught to consider subhuman operate with a discipline that exceeded their own. By the end of March, the 761st had liberated 30 towns, captured 4 airfields, and seized 3 massive ammunition dumps. Each town they took was another nail in the coffin of Nazi racial theory. Each surrender was a referendum on the fundamental lie that had driven the Third Reich. But as they pushed deeper into Austria, chasing the remnants of the SS, they were about to discover something that would break even the hardest among them. They were about to see what happens when a society fully embraces the lie of racial superiority and follows it to its inevitable conclusion. May 2, 1945. The 761st Tank Battalion was chasing retreating SS units through the Austrian countryside when the wind shifted. Before they saw the camp, they smelled it. The stench of death, industrial and overwhelming, carried for miles. When the Black Panthers rolled up to the gates of Gunskirchenlager, a subcamp of the Mauthausen concentration camp complex, the German guards had already fled. What remained were approximately 15,000 Hungarian Jews, most of them barely alive. The soldiers climbed out of their tanks and entered hell on earth. Living skeletons shuffled toward them, men and women reduced to skin stretched over bone, their eyes hollow and desperate. Bodies were stacked against the barracks like cordwood. The smell of human waste and death was suffocating. These were battle-hardened tankers. Men who had pulled burning friends from destroyed Shermans. Men who had seen dismembered corpses and German prisoners frozen in the snow. But this broke them. Sergeants who had led charges through German fire stood weeping openly. They emptied their pockets, giving away rations, chocolate, cigarettes, anything they had, knowing it wasn't nearly enough. Sergeant Samuel Turley made eye contact with a Jewish survivor who was barely standing. Neither man spoke. The survivor was too weak to form words. Turley was too overwhelmed to find them. But something passed between them in that moment, a recognition of shared suffering under different flags of hatred. They both understood what it meant to be declared less than human by a society that had embraced that lie completely. The 761st radioed for medical support and stayed to bear witness. This was what they had been fighting against all along. This was the end point of the ideology that said some humans were worth less than others. The Nazis had taken that lie and built factories of death around it. America had taken that same lie and built segregation around it. The scale was different, but the poison was the same. Days later, the war in Europe ended. The 761st Tank Battalion had fought for 183 consecutive days without relief, longer than any other armored battalion in Patton's Third Army. They had liberated 30 towns, 4 airfields, 3 ammunition dumps, and a concentration camp. Their casualty rate was staggering, 391 men killed or wounded. Their performance was undeniable. They had done everything their country asked of them and more. Then they went home. There were no ticker-tape parades for the Black Panthers. No newsreel celebrating the men who broke the Siegfried line or saved the 101st Airborne at Bastogne. When they stepped off the ships in American harbors, the color line was waiting for them exactly where they had left it. They returned to whites-only water fountains and the back doors of diners. Some were beaten for wearing their uniforms in public. Some were murdered. In Georgia, 1945, a bus station became a final battlefield. Sergeant Johnny Stevens boarded a bus with his white commanding officer, Captain David Williams. The driver took one look at Stevens and pointed to the back. Williams started to protest, but Stevens put his hand on his captain's shoulder and said, "It's all right, Captain. I know what I did over there. They don't have to." He walked to the back of the bus, his bronze star and purple heart clearly visible on his chest. The other passengers looked away. But something had changed, even if the nation refused to acknowledge it yet. The men of the 761st went home and told their children something the history books wouldn't print for decades. We were good enough to die for this country. Remember that. Those children grew up on stories of Bastogne and the Siegfried line, of their fathers breaking through impossible defenses and liberating concentration camps. They grew up asking a question that terrified the South. If our fathers were good enough to storm Hitler's Europe in 1944, why aren't we good enough to vote in Alabama in 1954? The seeds of the civil rights movement were planted in the living rooms of 761st veterans. When Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus in 1955, there were black veterans watching who remembered being ordered to the back after liberating concentration camps. When young people marched in Selma in 1965, some of their parents had marched through the Ardennes in 1944. The connection was never spoken on the evening news, but it pulsed through every sit-in, every freedom ride, every voter registration drive. You taught us we were soldiers. Now you're surprised we refuse to be servants. The wait for official recognition was long and bitter. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter awarded the 761st the Presidential Unit Citation. In 1997, 53 years after he died in a French field, Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers finally received the Medal of Honor. His sister Grace, 84 years old, accepted it from President Bill Clinton. When asked what she wanted people to know, Grace Rivers said simply, "My brother never doubted. Not for a second. He knew his worth. I wish America had known it sooner." The 761st Tank Battalion didn't just fight World War II. They fought the war before the war during the war, and the war after the war. They won all of them. It just took America half a century to notice. But their children didn't wait half a century. They picked up where their fathers left off, and this time they fought on American soil for American rights. The 761st didn't just break the Siegfried line. They broke the generational silence that allowed injustice to continue unchallenged. The 761st Tank Battalion received the Presidential Unit Citation in 1978 and 7 members eventually received the Purple Heart. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor in 1997, one of only 7 black soldiers from World War II to receive the nation's highest military honor. The battalion's official motto was "Come Out Fighting," and their legacy extends far beyond the battlefield into the struggle for civil rights that followed. If you found this story powerful, hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. These stories of courage and sacrifice deserve to be told and retold. Your engagement helps ensure that heroes like the men of the 761st are never forgotten again. Comment below if you have family members or know veterans who served, or simply let us know where you're watching from. Their sacrifice demands our remembrance.